Hi everyone, it's Lisa here. I'm back today with the second part of my mini series using this beautiful stamp from Concord 9th called Hello Lovely. For those of you that are just joining me today, I will link the first video in the series in the description below. But today I'm going to be doing some more watercolouring, but I'm going to be using my Derwent Inktense Pencils, and for something a bit different, and I guess it's a little bit of an experiment for me, I'm going to be using them on Neenah cardstock. So it's not a watercolour cardstock. So it is going to be interesting to see how they hold up. I saw a couple of videos from Therese. She's Lost in Paper on YouTube, and I'll link to her below as well. She's used Inktense pencils on Neenah a couple of times, but both times she's done it with stamps that have quite small colouring areas. So I think it's going to work really well for these outer images, but it's going to be more tricky to use it on this centre floral. The reason being that you really can't put much water down. It's not a watercolour cardstock. So I'm only going to be able to use a sparing amount of water, and I need to cover that area. Now I did do a little run through yesterday, and I'll show that to you in a minute, and you'll see what I'm going to try and avoid today. But for now I'll just quickly run through my supplies. That is the stamp set. I'm going to be colouring on the Neenah cardstock as mentioned before. This is £110. It's thicker obviously than the £80, and I'm guessing that's just going to hold up better with any kind of water. I've got a Simon Says Stamp Fog card base there, and I'm going to be using these stitched scallop basic edge dies from My Favourite Things. Now I have the 36 set of Inktense pencils, and these are my swatches that I did for it. I really don't use them often enough. They're absolutely gorgeous, these pencils, and I just forget that I have them. I think you can get a 72 set, but this is done on watercolour paper because mostly that is how you see these pencils being used. They are for watercolour, but they're not a traditional watercolour pencil. So let me just show you what I keep them in this folder here. I have no idea where this came from. My mum gave me this. So that's all the pencils that I have, and I'm just going to use 5 colours today. So the colours that I've chosen to use are the sun yellow, the beach green, the apple green, and then I've got fuchsia and Shiraz. The names are on the sides of the pencils here along with the numbers. Again, I'm going to keep my colour palette very simple for this card. You really can't do lots of layers because it's Neenah cardstock. You really have to limit your layers, and you definitely have to dry them in between. So anyway, let's get started. Okay, so today I'm going to use this stamp in a vertical orientation. So I'm going to use my Misty to stamp it down. I use the Misty because I don't have an acrylic block that is big enough for that stamp. And I'm going to be stamping it with VersaFine ONYX Black, as that is waterproof. But I am actually going to heat set this as well. I just want to make sure that because it's a different cardstock, I don't get any bleeding at all when I use the pencils on it. So I'm just going to press that firmly down. There shouldn't be too many problems stamping this as it's a smooth cardstock. So that looks good. Already got ink on my fingers. Okay, so I've taped that down onto my board, but before I get started on the colouring, I'm just going to show you the panel that I did yesterday as my little test piece. And I used a scrap of cardstock, as you can see. It's the back of an old card that I discarded, and you've got my stamp there. But by and large it did work really well, but I got this sort of horrible, two sort of horrible areas there when I did my layering, and they look worse close up than they probably do on the camera. But I just want to I want to see if I can avoid getting that today. I want to try and add a second layer onto it just to add a bit more interest, but I want to try and avoid those harsh lines. So what I should say first about these pencils is although they're watercolour pencils, the formulation, from my understanding, is very different to normal watercolour pencils. So these kind of have an ink formulation, hence the name Inktense. So when you put the colour down and you blend it out and it dries, it's permanent, so it doesn't reactivate with water. So that's important to remember. But other watercolour pencils, as you know, you can reactivate you can reactivate the watercolour with water, but you definitely can't do that. These stay permanent, but that does mean that you can colour on top of them, you can add other colours on top, you could put pencils on top. Apparently you can use them on fabrics as well. That's not my bag, so I wouldn't do that, but so they are slightly different in their formulation. So once you start blending them out, they do kind of stay put, so to speak. So I'm going to start off by just doing a couple of the leaves, and I'm literally going to take the pencil and put some of the pigment in. And if I was colouring on watercolour cardstock, I would probably use less pigment here, but because, as you'll see here, when I go to add in my colour, and I'm using just a damp brush here, so it's not holding much water at all. This is a number 2 round brush. It reactivates that pigment, but it doesn't allow it to travel that far, so it kind of stops in that area. It doesn't blend out through the whole leaf. So you get a little bit there where it's travelled a bit further, but by and large you see more of a line than you would perhaps on a watercolour cardstock. So they do work on here. I don't want this to sound as if they don't work on Neenah. They definitely do, but you just have to, I guess, know their limitations. So I'm going to add some more pigment in there and do the same on these leaves here. It's such a beautiful green. That is the apple green. So again, I'm adding some water into my brush, but I'm mostly tapping it off. And on this leaf, you can see it's travelled a little bit further. I'm going to zoom in just a tiny bit so you can see that a bit more clearly. Again, dipping my water, paintbrush in my water, dabbing it off, and I'm bringing it here over to this leaf here. So this one's travelled a little bit further. I think it really depends on how much water you put on, and I'm very, very wary of using a lot of water because I think this will pill and it probably will warp a little bit. Well, we'll see. I mean, it definitely did on this one yesterday. I did get some warping, but what I did do in the end was I just put it through the die cutting machine at the end and it flattened it out, so that actually didn't matter. So I'm going to carry on adding the apple green to the larger leaves. And this is a very large leaf here, so I'm actually going to add some pigment either side of that, because I know it's not going to travel that far when I blend it out. I'm probably going to end up with an area in the middle that is fairly light, and that's okay because I want to leave a highlight. I do still want to try and have quite an airy feel to this card, so light and airy, hopefully, and that should definitely be achievable if I'm not doing too many layers. So as you can see there, there's a lot of white on that one. And what you can also do is come in with the brush, take some off the tip, and then just add it direct to your cardstock and blend it out slightly. Which I'm probably going to do that up here. That gives you a little bit more control for smaller areas. So I'm going to go ahead and colour the rest of the leaves. I won't show you all of the colouring, you get the basic idea, and I'll go ahead and colour the rest of the leaves. And these smaller ones here I'm actually going to do in the beach green. My first layer of the leaves done. It's a very, I mean, they look really pretty, to be honest. It's really nice to see a watercolour look on a very bright white card. I'm not sure really why else you would use these pencils on Neenah, to be honest. I mean, if you've got watercolour cardstock, you'd probably just go ahead and use that for your watercolouring, but it is really nice to see how this image pops on white cardstock. And at the moment there is a little bit of an erased area there where I think I've probably used a bit too much water, but nothing major, nothing that I would be worried about anyway, because this is going to be adhered down onto a base. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add in the yellow, and I'm going to use the yellow for these three flowers here, and I'm just going to take the brush to the tip and do those in the same way that I did the smaller leaves. And it's really quick to do. I mean, they're such small images. Well, this sort of part of the image is so small. You can't do anything other than really just add one colour in, so it's pretty quick to do. There's not going to be any layers on this at all. As you can see, I'm dipping my brush into my clear water and then just dabbing it off on the paper towel so it's only ever damp when I bring it to the pencil. So I'm really limiting the water that goes onto the cardstock, but I'm using enough to activate the pigment. So that's that part, and now I'm just going to move on to the 5 flowers here and perhaps just show you live one of these petals here. So because they're quite large, I'm going to lay my pigment down onto the right up near the edge there, and I'm going to take it round here as well. Because it's not going to move very far, I really don't want to end up with loads of white space in the middle. I mean, you can fix that a little bit, and I'll show you how. If you end up with too much, you can just add more in. as you can see there, you just get, it just moves out slightly, but it really doesn't move out far. It's such a pretty colour this. This is fuchsia. So I did think my brush was a little bit too dry there, and it just didn't get the pigment moving. So you're not going to get the same watercolour look, that's for sure, but the paper does hold up reasonably well, and I would definitely say it's successful, but you do get a different look. So for instance, if I now want a little bit more colour in the centre, what I'm going to do is just take a tiny bit onto the tip of the brush, and I'm just going to add that in there. So it's not completely devoid of colour in the middle. I've got to be careful here, I really don't want to add in too much, and I am, it looks slightly blotchy there, but you know what, it's handmade, not Hallmark. That's what I say about a lot of my cards. They're not perfect, but then they're handmade, so they're not supposed to be perfect. So again, I'm going to add in the pigment around the edge there. I'm just going up, right up to the edge, because I know I'm going to, if I don't do that, I'm going to end up with a white line around the outside, as I did on my piece yesterday. So I can feel, or I can sense that this bit is starting to just get slightly raised. I thought that that would happen because it's a larger piece. So I'm going to wait for that to dry before I add in any more along the centre, because I think I'm in danger of that pilling if I go too much further. So I'll carry on colouring these. I'll put some music on, and I'll be back with you after I've done those. Okay, so that's the panel finish. That's just one layer of colour, and I'm quite happy with how that's come out. When I run my finger over this bit here, it is slightly raised on that area there. The rest of it's completely flat, and I have actually dried this with my heat tool now, because I'm going to go in and try and add some colour on top for a little bit of extra interest. So I'm going to take the beach green, and I'm just going to put some from the tip onto my brush, and I'm just going to add that in two parts. I'm being very careful here. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out. You have to make sure that you do actually pick some up. Yeah, so I'm just adding a little bit more depth onto some of those leaves. I think particularly where you've got the larger leaf, you want to add a little bit more colour onto that, so it isn't just the one colour. And so my layers are dry. I wouldn't do this, you definitely need to wait for them to dry, because otherwise the paper is going to pill. But you can add on top, same process, very little water. Just got some on the edge of the brush there. But you can go in and add some extra colour and blend that out. So I think it just adds a bit more variety into those bright green leaves. But you know, less is more. You have to be a little bit cautious. I mean, even if I was doing this on watercolour paper, you still have to exercise some caution when adding on the layers. You don't want to over darken some of the areas. And I'm going to try the same thing on the flowers. So I'll go back and finish the leaves afterwards, but I'm going to add, now this is the Shiraz colour, so this is a darker purple, and I just want to add a little bit in to those edges there. I won't be able to add any more water to that. I'm pretty sure that it's not going to make any difference if I try and blend that out any further. But as you can see, I've managed to get a darker area there just by adding a tiny bit on top, and that's a leaf that sits behind all the other, sorry, a petal that sits behind. So actually that would be dark. I'm going right up to the edge there. That's relatively, it's worked out quite well, just adding it onto the edges. I think it just takes it away from being a completely flat colour. So I wouldn't add in any more layers than that. And I will add a little bit onto each petal. It definitely just gives a different look. I quite like the kind of arty look it gives. It's a little bit more illustrative than you would get with normal watercolour perhaps, or even if you do this with Copics. Oh, I've got some blue, I'm not happy about that. But I'm going to leave it for a bit, and then I think I'll probably come back to that and see if I can change that. Definitely will need to let it dry first. I may actually close up. It looks fine. I can just see that it's kind of slightly splotchy, but you know, it's okay to have a few little imperfections. Okay, so I'm just going to finish off doing the flowers. Oh, I had too much water on there. There we go. And then I'm going to heat set this again, and I'll probably leave it at that point. So I've now heat set that with my heat gun, and I'm just going to try and even this area out a little bit. It feels dry, it's slightly puffy still, this area, but I'm actually going to be running this through the die cutting machine anyway, so I'm not overly worried. I've gone back to fuchsia here, and I'm just going to add in a little bit there over the top just to try and take that out, so it looks a little bit more even, that area. And although it's darker, that's okay. Flowers are not uniform. So that actually looks slightly better, I think, now that I've put a bit more colour down there and covered over some of those areas where it looked a little bit splotchy. So that's how it's looking. I have dried it. It still feels slightly puffy in the centre, but it's completely flat here. I mean, I'm not sure if you can see some slight denting on the back there, but it's nothing that isn't going to be fixed when you stick it down. So what I'm now going to do is I'm just going to cut off that bottom section. I'm going to run that through the die cutting machine. So I've die cut the bottom section off that, and I've added lots of tape onto the back. I thought rather than pop this up, I'd adhere this flat. It's actually, running it through the die cutting machine has made a difference. It really is absolutely fine to just pop on a card base. So I've just stamped a couple of the sentiments from the set onto some white cardstock using VersaFine ONYX black, and I'm just going to position those down. I thought I would do white today instead of black because the card is really kind of light and I've got the fog card base. I just thought that white would look better, so I'm just going to offset that one at the bottom there. So that finishes the card. No sequins, nothing. I'm just going to leave it as it is. That sits completely flat on that, and I absolutely love how this turned out in the end. When you look at it close up, you can actually see it almost looks as if it's been coloured with coloured pencils, because it didn't all blend out. You can still see a little bit of the pencil line in there, but it gives a really unique look, and it's definitely something that I'm going to try again. But let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful, and I'll be back soon with the third card in my series. Thanks ever so much for watching. Bye for now.